It started like any other school day. The sun was shining through the tall windows of the classroom, and the hum of chatter filled the air as students settled into their seats, backpacks slung over chairs, books stacked neatly on desks. Among them was the girl, just an ordinary schoolgirl with a backpack too heavy for her small frame, pencils poking out of the top, and a lunchbox decorated with cartoon characters she loved. She had woken up that morning like every other day, had eaten her breakfast in a rush because she didn't want to be late, and had walked the familiar route to school with her friends, laughing over shared jokes, unaware that this day would be anything but ordinary. She was quiet in class, but attentive, the type who scribbled notes meticulously, her handwriting small and precise. She raised her hand occasionally, answering questions correctly, and sometimes the teacher would smile at her because she seemed so focused, so diligent. She blended in with the other students, easy to overlook in a room full of lively chatter and movement. But there was something about her that made her presence noticeable, a certain carefulness, a slight tension in her posture, a way she observed the world around her with eyes that seemed to take everything in. During recess, she played with the other kids, though not as energetically. She walked across the playground with careful steps, occasionally glancing at the swings, the slide, and the group of children running tag. Her friends called her over, laughing, and she smiled, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes that day. She had a tendency to wander off slightly, not far enough to cause concern, but just enough to drift to the edges of the playground, picking up small things, examining them, a stone or a leaf, as if noticing details no one else did. Teachers had seen this before. She was simply a curious, observant child. When the morning lessons ended, she packed her things slowly, methodically, making sure her pencils were all lined up and her notebook stacked just right. She didn't rush like some of the other students who were eager to run out into the sunshine. Instead, she lingered for a moment, glancing around the classroom, perhaps at her friends, perhaps at the clock. Then she stood up, shoulder straps adjusted, and began walking down the hallway toward the next class. It was routine, unremarkable, yet it was in this moment, in the ordinary motion of walking through the school, that everything changed. No one noticed exactly when it happened. She moved through the corridors like she always did, passing lockers and teachers, nodding and greeting to classmates, until suddenly she was gone. Not missing in the way that someone might be absent from class, with a reason known, but missing in that inexplicable sense that leaves no trace, no indication of where she went. There was no call from home, no hall monitor watching, no one noticing her absence for several minutes. She had simply vanished from the line of sight of everyone around her, as though swallowed by the air itself. The disappearance was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Teachers continued with lessons, assuming she was still in the room or had stepped out for a moment. Her friends, distracted by their own conversations, didn't immediately register that she wasn't walking alongside them. It was only when she didn't appear in the next class that small murmurs began, questions whispered from desk to desk, a growing unease creeping into the room. Where had she gone? How long had she been gone? No one could say, and the first moments of confusion quickly turned into concern. The ordinary backdrop of the school, the walls decorated with student artwork, the squeak of sneakers on polished floors, the chatter of kids between classes, contrasted sharply with the strange, sudden absence of this one girl. Her disappearance went unnoticed in the moment, but became immediately significant once realized. The familiar rhythm of the school day continued, but beneath it, a ripple of uncertainty had formed, a sense that something was not right, that the mundane world she had been part of had shifted in ways no one could yet understand. No one noticed her absence at first. The school continued its routines as if nothing had changed. The classroom clocks ticked steadily, the teachers moved from lesson to lesson, and the students shuffled between classes, their voices blending into the familiar hum of activity. The girl had been there a moment ago, sitting at her desk, her notebook open, pencil in hand, and then she wasn't. Yet in the chaos of a school day, with its constant movement and distraction, the loss of one child for a few minutes could easily go unnoticed. It wasn't that anyone was careless. It was that 6 minutes can feel like nothing in a space where dozens of tasks, lessons, and interactions demand attention at once. Her friends were the first to feel something was off, though even they hesitated to say it aloud. One of them noticed the empty chair, another wondered why she hadn't turned the corner to the next class, and a third thought she must have gone to the restroom or to speak to a teacher. Assumptions were made, excuses formed in the mind, because the idea that a person could simply vanish for several minutes seemed impossible. And so, for a short while, her absence was swallowed by these small, plausible explanations, each one comforting in its ordinariness, each one delaying the realization that something was wrong. Meanwhile, teachers continued teaching, unaware of the gap in the room. Their attention was divided, focused on assignments, grading papers, managing the subtle chaos of a classroom full of children. They had seen students come and go, late arrivals and early departures, trips to the nurse or the bathroom, and they trusted the system to catch any real problem. In a setting so full of movement and noise, it was easy for one missing child to be overlooked. And yet, as minutes ticked by, the absence became more noticeable in a way that couldn't be ignored. The empty space where she had sat began to feel conspicuous, a small, growing emptiness that contrasted sharply with the familiar order of desks and chairs. It was only when someone looked up from their work that the first true signs of concern appeared. A teacher might glance across the room during a quiet moment, noticing that her pencil was still poised above her notebook, untouched, while the girl herself was nowhere in sight. Friends whispered to each other, their voices low but urgent, as they tried to piece together what had happened. They retraced their steps in their minds, recalling the hallways, the playground, the moments just before she had disappeared. Nothing made sense. Every memory seemed ordinary, yet it pointed to an extraordinary absence, a gap in time that couldn't be explained by routine or forgetfulness. Outside the classroom, the school itself seemed unaware of the anomaly. Hall monitors walked the corridors, students passed by in groups, and no one raised an alarm. The idea that someone could be gone for minutes and return unscathed was unimaginable, so it was easier to dismiss the situation temporarily than to confront the impossible truth. In those 6 minutes, the world continued without pause. The ringing of bells, the shifting of classes, the movement of students through hallways. All of it carried on as if her disappearance were nothing more than a minor blip, a brief interruption in the school day. Meanwhile, the girl herself was absent in a way no one could understand. Time passed differently for her, or perhaps it didn't pass at all, and the ordinary world carried on unaware. The tension of those minutes was not shared by anyone in the school. They remained blissfully ignorant, caught in their routines, while a single life was suspended outside their perception. And in the absence of witnesses, the mystery of what had occurred began to take shape in a way that would later become impossible to ignore, though at this stage it remained hidden, subtle, almost imperceptible, leaving only an empty chair, a paused pencil, and a growing, unspoken unease among those who noticed that something had shifted. It was as if the ordinary passage of time had swallowed her presence, leaving behind only traces of the girl who had been there moments ago. The minutes stretched in ways that could not be measured, and when she finally reappeared, it was into a world that had continued moving forward without her, a world that had not yet realized how much had changed in her absence. When she returned, it was sudden and almost unremarkable at first glance. One moment, the classroom was a place of concern and whispered speculation. The next moment she was back, walking through the doorway as if she had simply been delayed. Her backpack swung lightly over her shoulder, her hair slightly out of place, and her eyes scanning the room with that familiar, focused attention she always had. The initial relief that washed over the friends and teachers was immediate. She was back. She was safe. Nothing had happened that anyone needed to worry about. That was the instinctive response, the first thing people clung to, the natural human desire to return to normalcy when faced with uncertainty. But almost immediately, there was a subtle shift, something that made people pause and reconsider. The girl moved differently, her steps slightly heavier, more deliberate than before, as if each motion carried an unspoken weight. Her smile, though still present, lacked the ease it had had before, and when she spoke, her voice carried a tone that sounded familiar yet somehow off, like a recording played slightly too fast or too slow. Friends leaned closer, searching for what was different, trying to recognize the girl they had known for years. Something had changed, and the fact that no one could immediately articulate it only deepened the unease. Teachers were the first to notice it, even if only subconsciously. They observed her posture, her gestures, the small idiosyncrasies that made each student unique. Something about the way she held her notebooks, the way her fingers fidgeted, and the slight hesitation in her movements. All these tiny details suggested that the girl who had returned was not entirely the same as the one who had vanished. And yet, because the change was subtle, it was difficult to confront directly. People are conditioned to accept what they see at face value, and so most simply assumed she had been absent for a reason, perhaps caught up in thought, tired, or distracted, without realizing that this assumption was a fragile cover over something far stranger. Her friends noticed it too, though in a different way. They remembered the way she laughed, the spontaneous jokes, the little quirks that made her presence comforting and familiar. This girl returned with laughter that felt measured, jokes that didn't land the same, and a gaze that seemed to observe rather than connect. Conversations that would have flowed easily before now carried an awkward tension. She answered questions correctly, but the responses were clipped, lacking the natural warmth she usually conveyed. Something about her presence was unsettling, like staring at a familiar painting that had been altered ever so slightly. Recognizable, but undeniably changed. Even her belongings seemed to betray the subtle difference. Her backpack was placed carefully on her desk, her notebooks arranged in the way she always preferred, but the meticulousness was almost too precise, as if she had been rehearsing it. The pencil in her hand moved smoothly, yet there was a mechanical quality to her writing, a lack of the small, habitual tremors and flourishes that her handwriting had previously displayed. Teachers who glanced at her work noticed nothing overtly wrong, but those with a keen eye sensed the shift, the imperceptible alteration that marked a small but fundamental change in someone they had always understood. What had happened during those 6 minutes became the unspoken question hovering in the air. Everyone sensed that something extraordinary had occurred, yet no one could put it into words. It wasn't just the gap in time that mattered, but the fact that the girl who returned carried an aura of strangeness, an intangible difference that radiated quietly but unmistakably. The ordinary routines of the classroom, the familiar faces of friends, and the predictable flow of lessons all stood in contrast to this subtle but undeniable shift. Even casual observers, students passing by or teachers in adjacent classrooms, might have felt the change without realizing why. There was an energy in her movements that didn't belong entirely to the world she had left moments before. It was as if she had returned carrying a fragment of something beyond the ordinary, something that had touched her in those minutes and left a mark, imperceptible to most but detectable by anyone attuned to subtle shifts in behavior and presence. Friends and family sensed it immediately, though describing it was almost impossible. The girl was physically the same, her hair the same length, her eyes the same color, her clothes unchanged, but something intangible had shifted. It was in the way she moved through the room, the way she interacted, the tone of her voice, and even the way she looked at people around her. Her parents noticed it first when she walked through the front door after school. They expected the familiar rush of chatter, the recounting of a day full of ordinary school events, but instead, she paused, her gaze distant, her words careful, measured, almost rehearsed. The comfort of the familiar was missing, replaced by a subtle tension that no one could quite name. Her friends were more attuned to subtle cues because they had shared so much time with her in school. They noticed the small differences that might have seemed insignificant to an outsider. The way she no longer laughed at the same jokes, the way she paused slightly before answering questions, or the way she looked at them, not with the warmth they remembered, but with something distant and calculating. Conversations that had once flowed naturally now carried pauses, awkward transitions, and responses that didn't quite fit the context. There was a hollow familiarity in her behavior, as if she was trying to imitate the girl they knew, but without the effortless ease that had always defined her presence. Teachers noticed too, but in a more clinical way. They observed her posture, her attentiveness, and the way she engaged with lessons. She still participated, still followed instructions, and still performed tasks correctly, but there was an unnatural precision to her actions, a carefulness that had not been there before. Even the smallest gestures, raising a hand, picking up a pencil, turning the page of a notebook, seemed slightly off, as though she were moving according to a set of rules rather than natural instinct. These observations, small though they were, added to the growing sense that something fundamental had changed in the girl who had returned. Her parents began to notice behavioral changes at home as well. The routines she had followed without question now seemed deliberate, almost calculated. Meals were eaten in silence, homework completed with robotic efficiency, and bedtime routines followed with an exactness that suggested she was holding herself to a standard she hadn't before. There was no rebellion, no energy of adolescence in the way she had previously expressed herself, only a controlled, measured version of herself, carefully navigating the world around her. Even the warmth of her hugs felt different, a little too long, a little too firm, lacking the spontaneous affection they had once expected. Friends tried to connect, but there was an unmistakable barrier. When they asked questions, she answered politely, but without the usual inflection, without the little asides or jokes that had once made her responses feel genuine. Her eyes, though familiar in color and shape, seemed to observe more than they expressed, scanning situations as if she were calculating how to respond rather than reacting naturally. Playful teasing was met with polite acknowledgement, not laughter, and the easy camaraderie that had defined their friendship felt fractured, replaced by a cautious engagement that made everyone uneasy. Even strangers who encountered her could sense a subtle difference. Walks home from school, interactions at the corner store, casual greetings in the neighborhood, all carried a hint of something unusual. She seemed aware of things she hadn't been before, noticing small details, remembering things she shouldn't have, responding with precision and calm in situations that might have flustered her previously. There was a maturity, or perhaps a detachment, in her presence that contradicted her age, an awareness that seemed beyond her years. Family and friends began to whisper among themselves, exchanging observations that individually seemed minor, but collectively suggested a transformation. Her favorite activities were approached with a new intensity or avoided altogether, her mannerisms subtly altered, her reactions measured in a way that had not been true before. Even the warmth of her personality, the qualities that had defined her interactions, seemed to have shifted, replaced by a version of herself that was familiar yet fundamentally different. And yet, despite all these observations, she was still the girl everyone recognized. Her name was the same, her appearance the same, and her presence still rooted in the same spaces she had occupied before. The paradox of familiarity and difference created a tension in every interaction, a quiet but persistent unease that grew with each passing hour. No one could fully explain it, and yet everyone who encountered her knew, in some instinctive way, that the girl who had returned was not entirely the same. Questions began to rise almost immediately, though nobody had answers, and the questions themselves felt heavier than the absence of explanation should allow. Where had she gone during those 6 minutes? What had she experienced that could account for the subtle changes in her behavior, her expressions, her very presence? People asked these questions quietly at first, in whispers to themselves or to those they trusted, as if voicing them aloud might somehow make the reality more unsettling. The ordinary world had resumed its rhythm, but beneath the surface, a tension built, a shared understanding that something extraordinary had happened, and that the missing minutes held a truth no one yet understood. Teachers questioned what they had seen, replaying their memories of the day. They remembered her walking through the hallways, her sudden absence, the unremarkable moment of her return, and the subtle differences that followed. Each detail seemed minor on its own, but collectively, they formed a pattern that suggested something beyond explanation. They wondered if they had imagined it, if fatigue or distraction had caused them to misinterpret what they saw. And yet, the persistent discomfort in their observations refused to be ignored, forcing them to consider the possibility that the events of those 6 minutes had changed something fundamental. Friends of the girl tried to reconcile the person they remembered with the person who had returned. They asked questions that seemed normal. Where were you? Are you okay? But each answer they received felt rehearsed, measured, and incomplete. There was a gap in understanding that could not be bridged by words alone, an invisible wall separating the girl they knew from the version of her that had returned. The questions multiplied, feeding an almost obsessive curiosity about the events that had unfolded during the minutes no one could account for. Was it a prank, an accident, or something more inexplicable? The absence of evidence only heightened the anxiety surrounding the questions themselves. Even the girl's parents, who wanted nothing more than to accept her return as normal, found themselves grappling with their own questions. They asked gently, cautiously, hoping to coax an explanation from her that would restore a sense of safety and familiarity. Did something happen? Who were you with? Were you scared? Each inquiry was met with responses that were polite but distant, detailed enough to seem truthful, yet missing the warmth and spontaneity they had expected. The more they tried to understand, the clearer it became that the truth was either inaccessible or deliberately concealed, leaving them with uncertainty that gnawed quietly at the edges of their relief. The wider community also began to sense that something unusual had occurred. Teachers in other classrooms, students who had passed her in the hall, even neighbors who saw her walking home, all noticed subtle anomalies in her behavior. A shared awareness emerged, a collective questioning that hung in the air unspoken. People speculated, exchanged theories, and tried to piece together a timeline that could make sense of what had happened. Every scenario seemed inadequate, and each answer only created more questions. The 6 minutes became a puzzle, a blank space in the narrative of a familiar day that defied logic and understanding. Some questions were practical. Where exactly had she been? Why was she gone without notice? How had no one detected her absence sooner? Others were deeper, more existential. What could cause a person to change so subtly yet fundamentally in such a short span? Was she the same person who had left, or had something entered into her during that time? Something that could not be explained by ordinary experience. Every interaction, every observation of her after she returned seemed to confirm that the missing minutes were significant in ways beyond comprehension, that they had left an indelible mark on her, a mark that no one could remove or ignore. The intensity of the questions was compounded by the fact that there were no answers. No one had witnessed her disappearance, no one could testify to her whereabouts, and no one could explain what had caused the shift in her behavior. Each question hung in the air like a shadow, unacknowledged but undeniably present, influencing every conversation, every glance, every cautious step taken by those around her. The uncertainty created a tension that was almost palpable, a shared acknowledgement that the ordinary world had been pierced by something strange, something that could not yet be understood. In classrooms, hallways, homes, and playgrounds, the questions lingered. Teachers and students alike replayed moments, searching for clues that might provide answers. Friends whispered, parents pondered, neighbors speculated, and all the while, the girl moved among them, her presence both familiar and foreign, a living reminder that the questions were not rhetorical. They were real, pressing, and impossible to ignore. The story began to blur the line between reality and the unexplained, leaving everyone who witnessed it in a state of quiet disbelief. It was one thing to see a girl return after a brief absence, a minor disruption in the school day, but it was another thing entirely to sense that she had changed in ways that could not be measured or explained. Ordinary explanations, the mundane, the everyday, failed to account for the subtle alterations in her behavior, her gaze, her tone, and her presence. There was something about the event that defied logic, that seemed to hover at the edge of perception, a riddle wrapped in the familiarity of everyday life, and yet no one could ignore it. People began to question the reliability of what they had witnessed. Memory became slippery. Did they truly see her vanish, or had it been a trick of the mind? Were the differences in her behavior real, or were they projecting unease onto normal variations in a child's mood and expression? Each person who observed her had their own interpretation, and yet all interpretations led to the same uneasy conclusion. Something extraordinary had occurred, something that resisted categorization. The ordinary framework of understanding could not contain it, leaving a lingering sense of cognitive dissonance that colored every encounter with her after her return. Even casual interactions carried a weight of tension. Simple greetings, shared laughter, and ordinary conversations were transformed by the unspoken awareness that she was different. Friends noted the absence of spontaneity, the careful choice of words, the subtle, almost imperceptible distancing in her gaze. Teachers remarked on the precision of her movements, the absence of the small quirks that had previously made her human and relatable. Family members sensed a detachment, a quiet observation that seemed to take in the world without fully participating in it. Each interaction reinforced the feeling that the 6 minutes had introduced something foreign into her life, a presence or influence that lingered even in the most mundane settings. Rumors began to circulate, whispered quietly in hallways and homes, in playgrounds and classrooms. Some speculated about accidents, some about pranks, and others about things far more unexplainable. Every story carried a kernel of fear, a recognition that ordinary explanations were inadequate, that the event had crossed into a space where reason and logic could not reach. Yet no one could provide proof, and the lack of evidence only heightened the sense of unease. The community was left suspended in uncertainty, grappling with a reality that seemed to obey its own rules, a reality that the 6 missing minutes had altered irreversibly. The more time passed, the more the ordinary world seemed to clash with the extraordinary perception of her presence. Classrooms, homes, and streets remained the same physically, unchanged in structure or routine, but the subtle shifts in her behavior cast a shadow over them. The familiar became strange, and the normal rhythms of daily life were tinged with an awareness that there was more beneath the surface than anyone could articulate. The tension was quiet but persistent, manifesting in second glances, cautious questions, and the lingering sensation that something was out of place. Even the girl herself seemed aware of the difference, though she never acknowledged it directly. She moved carefully through her environment, responded politely but with measured intent, and maintained a distance in her interactions that was noticeable to those who had known her intimately. There was an internal awareness in her that suggested memory, perception, or understanding of the missing minutes was present in some form, influencing her actions and creating the subtle but undeniable changes observed by everyone around her. The ordinary school day had become a stage for something extraordinary, a space where the rules of perception and reality seemed to bend around her presence. The blurring of reality and the unexplained did not remain confined to observation alone. It affected emotions, relationships, and expectations. Friends hesitated, unsure how to approach her. Teachers were cautious, noticing details they might have overlooked in the past. Parents were concerned, simultaneously relieved by her return and troubled by the subtle differences in her demeanor. Every interaction carried a duality, the girl they recognized and the girl transformed by whatever had occurred during those 6 minutes. The ordinary and the extraordinary coexisted uneasily, creating a tension that could not be resolved through logic or reassurance. Even those with no direct connection to her began to sense the oddity. Passing strangers, casual observers, and people in the wider community would notice a dissonance in her behavior, the careful way she carried herself, the subtle intelligence or awareness in her eyes. These impressions were fleeting but profound, leaving an echo of unease that spread quietly, demonstrating that the blurring between reality and the unexplained was not confined to those closest to her, but resonated outward, touching anyone perceptive enough to notice that something beyond the ordinary had occurred. The longer the days went on, the clearer it became that her disappearance, brief as it was, had left a permanent mark, a fracture between the world as it had been and the world as it now existed with her presence in it. People could try to rationalize, to explain, to return to normalcy, but each observation, each interaction, and each subtle shift reminded them that the ordinary had been altered, that the 6 minutes had introduced an element of mystery that refused to be contained, and that whatever had happened in that time was impossible to ignore.